Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using Angular 10 and ASP.NET Core 3. In the last video tutorial, we finished coding the admin authentication handler. One thing that was missing in the last video tutorial was adding the access denied view in our application, since we are redirecting the users when the authentication fails to the access denied path. We just need to add this view. So I have created this view in the account controller. I've called this view as access denied, and then I have added the following line of codes. So it's just HTML and some jQuery that I use to change the background color of the page when the page loads. For the CSS for the access denied page is already added in the admin.css file, which we had added in one of the previous video tutorials when we were applying styling to the admin panel. So we don't need to add any styling in case if you're using my code. As soon as you add the access denied page, create the access denied page and you add these following code, it should pick up the styling and add the required styling. Now let's go ahead, close this, and now since the authentication handler is created, let's go and look at the authentication process and understand what we need to do next while adding this authorization and authentication to the admin panel. So here is the authentication process that we have in our application. We have created the model class to store the token information in our database. We have implemented the authentication handler for the admin. In the authentication handler, we are validating the JWT token after we have decrypted it. But we have not yet implemented or added the code to create these JWT tokens. And the JWT tokens initially are issued to the user when their login is successful. So which means that when the user logs in our application, they send us their email and password. We validate this information and we provide them an encrypted auth token and a refresh token. So this auth token and refresh token is provided by the authentication service, and the request is sent in by the login view. So now in this video tutorial, let's implement the functionality where we can receive the request from our login view and send it to the authentication service. So let's start working on the authentication service for creating tokens and implementing JWT tokens in our web project. So let's go ahead and add or create the authentication service in our project. So as we have maintained a structure in our application where we are creating all the services in separate class library projects, we'll go ahead and create a new class library project in our application, and we will call this project as auth service. So we are going to go to web console library, select the .NET Core class library, hit next. Here we will name this project as auth service. Here we will change the folder in which the project will stay. So we will make sure that the project is inside the folder which contains all our projects, not inside the folder which contains the csproj file. So make sure that you create the project inside the folder which contains all your projects and then click open, and now we can click create. So our auth service project is created. We don't need this default class, so we will delete this default class, and here we will install the required NUGET packages. So right click and add or manage the NUGET packages. Here we will search for two packages that we need. The first package is identity. So the first package is identity model.tokens. So I'm going to search it. So the first package you'll install is Microsoft.IdentityModel.Tokens. Let's go ahead and install the latest stable version, which is 6.7.1 at the time of recording this video tutorial. Let's install the second package that we need, and the second package is System.IdentityModels.Tokens.Jwt. So IdentityModels.Tokens.Jwt, and that's the package that we are going to install, System.IdentityModel.Tokens.Jwt. We will make sure we install the latest stable version available at this time of recording the video is 6.7.1. So I will add the package. The package is being installed and the package was successfully installed. All we need is these two packages in our authentication service, and now we will start working on the authentication service. We will add two classes in the authentication service. So let's go ahead and add one new class. We will call this as auth service, or as SVC, short form for service, and we will hit new, and then we will create a interface to call the methods within the auth service class. So let's add a interface. I'll call this interface as auth SVC and hit new. I'll make sure that this class has been extended to the interface or implements the interface auth SVC. And now we will start adding the required logic, methods or functionality within the auth service that is required to create tokens, authenticate the user, and so on. So in the auth service class, we need certain dependencies, and we need to inject these dependencies using dependency injection through the constructor of this class. And we will go ahead and create the required objects. So I will paste the objects that I require over here, and I will start referencing them in this class by adding the import statement. So the first object I require is an instance of user manager class, and user manager, as we know, is a part of ASP.NET Identity. So I'm not going to install the ASP.NET Core Identity package here. Instead, I can just reference the model service project, and the reference to ASP.NET Core Identity will be added. So if I can right click on the auth service project and go ahead and add the reference to the model service project, I should be able to get the required classes for ASP.NET Core Identity, because I have already referenced them in the model service class. Then I also need the logging service to log any errors that are caused in the authentication process. I also need access to the data service, since the user is logging in our database and fetching information. We would need the access to data service. And finally, we would also need to create another service, which we will do in a bit. So first, let's add these three references. And once these references are added, we can then add the import statement to the required objects that we are trying to instantiate in this class. So here for the user manager, we can add reference to ASP.NET Core Identity, since we already have referenced the model service project. Here I will start adding the reference. For application DB context, I reference the using data service project. Now the cookie service, we need to create this. I'll speak about it in a bit. The activity service as well, we want to create this project as well to keep track of the activities of the user. And let's first reference the iData protection. So token validation parameters using identity model tokens, we have already installed this NUGET package, and we'll also reference the JWT package that we have installed. And finally, the claims principle is part of using system.security.claims. Now there are two objects that we cannot reference yet because we have not yet created them. These are the interface to access those objects. Let's go ahead and create these projects, one for cookie service and one for activity service. So first let's create this project. So right click on our project and add a new project. It's going to be a library under web and console, and then I'm going to select the .NET Core library and I'm going to call this cookie service. I'm going to make sure that I create the project inside the folder which contains all the projects, and I'm going to create this project which is cookie service. Next thing I'm going to add is another project to keep track of all the activities of the user, whether when the user logs in, when the user logs out, on some failed authentication and so on. So let's go ahead and add this project. I'll call this activity service, and I will create this project once again inside the project folder which contains all my class library projects. So let's get rid of the default class that is created in both these projects. Now we need to go and add the required classes in both these projects. So let's add the classes for activity service. I'll call this class as activity SVC, short form for service. Also add an interface. I'll call this iActivity service. Let's add the files in the cookie service as well. And an interface to access the methods. I'll call it iCookie service. So now we have the required classes that we have here. Let's go ahead and reference these projects in the auth service project. So the cookie service will be responsible to delete all cookies, to fetch cookies from the browsers, to read the cookies, and so on. Whereas the activity service, as I mentioned, will keep track of the user's activity. If you have watched the demo of the finished project, I've shown you in the finished project that when we go to the profile option over here, we have an option to check the activity log. And when we click on the activity log, we are keeping track of when the user logs in, and the user can see this activity under the activity log section that we are going to create. So let's go back to the project. And now you know why we need the activity service and the cookie service. So let's go back to the auth service and add the missing import statements for cookie service and for activity service. We will add the required methods. Once we finish the auth service, we will start working on the other projects that we created. So right now, let's go ahead and inject these dependencies and instantiate them in the constructor of auth service. So here I have added the required classes that I need to instantiate, or required objects that I need to instantiate in the constructor. I'm using interface options from Microsoft extension.options to access the values from app settings and data protection, which are located inside the app settings file of the startup project. We also need the cookie service and the activity service, so I have instantiated them as well using dependency injection in the constructor. We also would need an instance of the iService provider to instantiate some services or to get the required services. Now let's go ahead and assign the values of these objects to the required properties that we have created here. So now that should be it for the constructor, and that should be it for the required properties that we need in this particular class. Now let's work on the required methods that we need for authenticating the user. We are going to create a method called as auth. So let's go ahead and create this method. So let's add the method here, and let's add the import statement for task using system.threading.task. Here, when the user's authentication is successful, we are going to return a token. So I'm going to create a class for token response that we are going to send back to the client. So let's go ahead and add this token response model class in the model service. So the constructor is not needed, so I'll delete it. And now here we will add the required properties that we need in this specific class. So let's add the properties. So we need the following properties here. One is the token itself, which will be a string, the date time, which basically is the time to when the token is going to expire. When the refresh token is going to expire, we need to store that time. We need the value of the refresh token. Once again, it's going to be a string. We need to store the role of the user, username, user ID, two-factor login. If the two-factor login validation is on, if the user has his two-factor settings set to on, then we need to make sure that we include the second step in while the user tries to log in by sending them a code. And here we need the claims principal, access to the claims principal of the user security claims. And we also need to create a response info, which we are going to create using a class called as response state info model. So I'll go ahead and add that class here. Go back to the token response model, and now this class should be complete with all the required properties. For the response status info model, I'm going to need some properties over here, so I'm going to get rid of the constructor. And here I just need two properties. One is the message that I'm going to send back in the response, whether the response was success, fail, or it was an error that they received. And the HTTP status code can be status OK, can be 200, can be 401 unauthorized. So we need this object status code here. So we will import the system.net reference in this class, and that should get rid of the error. And now the response state info model will contain these two properties, which will be part of the token response model. So now we have the token response model set up here. So we are going to go back to the auth service, and what we are going to return is this response when the authentication request comes in. So we are passing the login view model to the parameter of this function, and the login view model is basically the email and password of the user, and a optional value which is remember me if the user wants us to remember their login details. Now here inside this auth service, we also need to make sure that we create a method where if we encounter any error, we can send a error response in the token response, and we can use this error response in other methods that we are creating. It's like an extension method that we will use to create error responses for our client, and it will be a private method. So all the private methods, I'm going to list them under this section here. So I'm just going to create this method. I'll call it create error response token. And what this method does is sends a token response model as well, but we are going to set the status code in the parameter. When we call this method, we are going to tell what the status code of this method will be. It can be 401, it can be HTTP status code unauthorized, it can be bad request, or it can be 500 internal server, depends. But anytime we need to send an error response, we can use this extension method and we can provide the message and the code in this message in the parameters of this method, and the response will be created. So let's add the reference to using system.net so we get rid of this error. And we also need to create another extension method that will instantiate the response info model class object and create a response for us. I will create another method over here called as create response. So this create response method will give us an object of type response status info model. And once again, we will supply the error message and the status code in the parameters of the message of the method when we are calling it. So these two methods should be uh, enough for the response or creating the error response. Now let's go ahead and start working on the auth method, which is going to return a token response model. So now let's add a TryCatch block in the auth method so that we can catch any errors that we receive in the request. If some of the other class or projects or service in our class is not working and there is an error, we can catch it and we can log it in the log file. So we have already created the logging service and reference that project. All we need to do is log a message using the serilogs log.error method, and we can add the error. So reference using serilog. If you have not already referenced the logging service project, go ahead and reference it in the auth service in order to use the using serilog import statement. Now, if there is an error, we will log the error, and finally we are going to return a error response back to the user. And we can do that by just calling this extension method we just created. All we need to provide is a message in the parameter and the status code. So the status code will be unauthorized 401. So we are just going to return a response of 401 because our services are either not working or something in our application has failed. There is a bug we don't know. So we'll just return unauthorized so that the user cannot log in while the application status is probably down or we have some error. So now here, let's inside the try block write the logic for validating this user with his email and password. So the first initial validation steps would be from the login view model that we receive in the parameters of this method. We are going to check if the user exists in our database. From the model.email property, we will supply the model.email property to the user manager and call the method find by email async and try to find any user in our database which has an email that matches the email that we have received. If we don't have any user, the response is null. We are going to return a response of HTTP status code unauthorized. We're going to create a error response. If we found a user in our database with that specific email, then we are going to check if the role of that user is a administrator, which basically means that we are trying to authenticate the user to check if the user role is admin role or it's a regular customer role. So if it's an admin role, we can proceed further. If it's not an admin role, then we create a error response and send a response of 401, which is unauthorized, back to the client. We need to add the reference to system.link here because we need the first or the default result that we get in this particular query that we are executing. Now, also I need to mention that this particular auth method will be used for authenticating the admin. So we will have another method that we are going to create, another auth method that we will create, which will be used to authenticate all other users. But for admin, I have created a separate authentication method because the levels of authentication or security are different compared to what we are going to do with a regular user. So next thing, after these steps have been validated, we know that the user role is admin. So now we will further execute our validation and try to validate the password of the user. So here we will say if the user is admin, we execute this code further. We check if the supplied password is correct using the user manager.check password async method, and we will await for the response of this asynchronous method. And if the response is failed, it's false, then we will return a error response and log the error. Now if the response is success, which means that the supplied password is correct, it matches the one we have in the database. So let's go ahead and then create the token for the user. So one more step before we create the token, we need to make sure that the email of this user is confirmed. So whenever a user registers in your application, we want to make sure that their email is confirmed, or any user that you create in your application from the backend, you create an admin role. We want to make sure that that user has verified their email. So we can add another piece of code here which will validate that for us. Using user managers is email confirmed method, we can confirm if the user's email is confirmed or verified. All we need to do is pass the user object to the parameters of this method, and we will get the response as true or false. So if the response is false, the email is not confirmed, we will create an error response of unauthorized, and we will send it back to the client. Now finally, everything, all validations have been passed. Now let's go ahead and create the token for the user. So here we will create the token and we will return the token back to the client. Now we need to create this extension method. Since I don't want to make this method very lengthy, I will write the code to create the token in this method called as generate new token, which can also be used by other authentication methods that we are going to create. So we can put all the code generation logic inside one method, which will be called as generate new token. So let's go ahead and add this method here in under private methods that we have. So here I will add the generate new token method, and I'm going to now write the logic to generate a new token so that we can send it back to this request that we're getting from the auth method, and then it can be returned back to the client. So obviously we need to return a response of return an object of type token response model, because that's what we are returning back to our client. So that's what this method is going to do. So let's go ahead and write the logic to generate the token. So adding the new token, we will do it in the next video tutorial, since this video tutorial is quite lengthy now. So let's create it in the next part of this video tutorial. So if you have any questions, use the comment section. The code for this video tutorial will be provided in the DevOps repo. The link will be in the video description. Please like and subscribe our channel Tech Howdy.